I want to keep calling it kimchi, but I know that's not what it is. Karachi. Hey guys, it's Mr. Kies here with another video for you guys, and this time it is an 8th grade video recapping the chapters in I Am Malala that we have read this week. There's been quite a lot going on, and things are really starting to ramp up as far as the story is concerned. So let's talk about some of the events that have gone on so far in the chapters that we've read and what that means going forward. So we start with chapter 16, and just to give us a little bit of background before we hit chapter 16, if you remember, Malala and her family were basically forced to flee from SWAT and from their homes because the increased presence of the Taliban in the area and the fighting with the Pakistani army and the Taliban at that time. So they're able to, in chapter 16, return after being IDPs or internally displaced peoples. As they make their way home, there's a lot of talk of how there's been looting and people basically breaking into homes and stealing things at the time. Fortunately, Malala's family was not affected by that. They still have all of their things, or at least most of them. Malala still has her books, which she was very worried about. And by and large, their house was not affected by that. The same cannot be said necessarily for the school. It wasn't like burned down or anything like that, nothing destroyed, but it was clear that people had been living in the school and it had been utilized as like a base or like a hideout spot for the Pakistani army. People were like writing on the whiteboards, and there were sections of like bullet holes and things like that in walls. So you get to really see like the actual practical impact of what it meant to have essentially their neighborhood and their homes be a battlefield, which was certainly eye-opening for Malala. What was also eye-opening for Malala was getting to go into the capital. They were able to spend time in the city and go see different things and be like actual, children and things like that. She saw women walking around without their purdah on, so she did that a couple times, and she thought that she was a real mature woman for doing that. Around this time too, she was able to, and a number of her classmates, go and actually speak with leadership in Pakistan. At this time, she and her classmates are able to actually start to meet some Pakistani leadership, and she's able to meet a general who was like in charge of public relations and ask them questions about how they were going to help the people in SWAT or some of the other events that are going on and help the people in Pakistan. And what she's starting to learn is that there aren't too many people who really have the people's interests at heart. They're trying to just kind of get by on, these nice little sound bites and things that sound good, especially as like a military person, but no real concrete plans on how to help the people in Pakistan. And she's starting to learn very quickly that there aren't people really in place to help the individuals in the country that are the most greatly affected, and that's going to start to become a reoccurring theme as the chapters go along. We're starting to see an attempt at returning to normalcy and trying to get back into the ways that things were before they were IDPs, but Malala is learning that that may not necessarily be the case, and things really start to ramp up when we hit the major flooding in Pakistan. So shortly after Malala turns 13, the flooding starts to impact Pakistan. There are massive rains, and you start to get overflows of all the rivers in the area. The tributaries start to go overflowing, and it starts to flood massive parts of the country, and thousands of people are displaced, millions of dollars of damage done. And unfortunately, this is a time period in the world where not a lot of aid is going to be able to be provided because we're starting to hit the massive stock market crash thanks to the real estate crisis in the US. So countries that would normally be financially prepared to help Pakistan during the situation isn't really able to do so. And so they're kind of left on their own to try to figure this out. And unfortunately, their leadership in the country itself is not adequately prepared for that. If you remember the documentary, Malala talks about how she's going to school so that she can become a doctor. And I think she mentions it in the autobiography as well, but this is where we start to see that she's actually making more political aspirations, because she wants to be that person in her country who is able to help out the people that need it the most and isn't just there to better herself. And that's kind of her thought process on leadership in Pakistan at this time. And that kind of wraps up chapter 16 for us there. Chapter 17 is a packed chapter. There's a lot going on in here, not only in terms of Malala's life, but also in the greater world that is surrounding her. It starts off pretty innocuously as her talking about how she wanted to become taller, but then quickly shifts into talking about the plight and the problems that are happening in her area after the military operation, namely the people that had gone missing. There are a number of men that have gone missing, either captured by Taliban forces or captured by the Pakistani army. And that's an issue in a country like Pakistan, because if you have women who were married to these particular men, they're not considered widows because there's no body, there's nothing to identify. So at this point, they're kind of like people without no one there to support them and help them out. They're essentially not people because they're associated with their husband. Even if their husband or father has gone missing, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are able to get any kind of freedom or compensation as a result of that. So a lot of people are really not only concerned for their loved ones and the well-being of their loved ones, but also the kind of freedoms that have been taken away as a result of these situations. And it really comes to a head when we have the Raymond Davis situation. So Raymond Davis was a U.S. diplomat and a CIA contractor. He'd been working with the CIA, and he, in some kind of conflict with two men, he ended up shooting and killing two men in Lahore in the streets. A third man was also killed by a hit-and-run driver who was trying to help out Davis. And the Pakistani government was furious. There's this American person who's essentially committed a double murder and had a weapon that he wasn't supposed to have. And the U.S. is basically claiming that he has diplomatic immunity, that he needs to be released and returned to the U.S.
If our diplomats are in another country, then they are not subject to that country's local prosecution.
That he's done nothing wrong. He claimed self-defense. No witnesses were able to support that or even do anything to cover that particular claim. But this turned into a huge issue for U.S.-Pakistani relations. This was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back in a lot of ways. You have this individual who's working essentially with the CIA, with the U.S. government, who commits this crime, who kills these two men. And the U.S. is basically saying, no, he's fine, you need to give him back to us, he has immunity. The Pakistani government's like, we need to have something to show, like there needs to be punishment for committing a crime like this. And eventually what happens is they pay 2 million rupees to the families of the individuals who were killed in what is called diya. It's essentially like blood money. This crime was committed, but we've paid you money, so everything's all good now. And as Malala mentions, one of the widows of the men, she ends up overdosing on sleeping pills, so she kills herself, or she dies rather. And this just sparks this huge issue in terms of U.S.-Pakistani relations, because basically, as Malala had said, it was as if the CIA was able to do basically just whatever they wanted in Pakistan. And then it really ramps up when the big news of the year drops.
We have caught and compromised to a permanent end Osama bin Laden.
Good evening. Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda.
So this was a massive news story. This was everywhere. I remember being in a pizza place in the town that I was living in Texas when I saw the news that SEAL Team 6 had gone in and not only managed to find but also managed to kill Osama bin Laden, the person who was the mastermind behind the Al-Qaeda attacks on the World Trade Center on 9/11. And it's interesting to see multiple perspectives on this, because I remember seeing it happen, or rather hearing the news about it, and it being just this like, almost like a relief, just like, oh man, this guy that caused so many problems and so many deaths and really had a traumatic impact on our country, he is now finally gone. Like this massive manhunt, this massive search has finally ended. And it was really interesting to see the news that had been coming out about it, because it wasn't like the Saddam Hussein situation, because we had tried to find Saddam Hussein as well, and he was in like this little spider hole thing where he was like dug away and had his massive beard and was looking really just in rough shape. Bin Laden was living in like a fortress, like a compound in Pakistan. Like he was not hiding out anywhere. He was very much hiding in plain sight. It was clear that he was in a pretty comfortable position. He had had children while he was in hiding. And in fact, they were born in hospitals in the area. And this really sparked a lot of a lot more conflict from the U.S. side of things, because from their perspective, it should have been very obvious that Osama bin Laden was where he was, but the Pakistani government and Pakistani intelligence clearly didn't get that message, because here he was this entire time, and they knew we were searching for him, and they weren't even able to find him, even though he wasn't exactly hiding all that hard. There were a lot of conspiracy theories that were coming out around the time, and a number of them were talked about from both sides of it. The U.S. obviously saying Pakistan was clearly aiding and helping Osama bin Laden during this time, otherwise he'd have been found much sooner. They didn't even involve the Pakistani government really in the operation to take him down, which from the American perspective is clearly they were doing something to help this guy out and help him hide. It was interesting to see the ones on the Pakistani side where they were saying that Osama bin Laden had been killed several years earlier, and they had planted this whole action and this whole situation to make it seem as if Pakistan was hiding him, so that it was an American thing to basically make this look like it had happened that way. One of the ones that I remember hearing about at the time was that Osama bin Laden actually hadn't been killed, and that this whole operation was, again, just a plot by the Americans to make it seem as if they had done that, but because they didn't show the body, or because there wasn't this public funeral, there was no way to actually confirm that it was bin Laden that had been killed. So a lot of people were saying, no, bin Laden's still alive, actually. This is just the Americans trying to pull some nonsense. This was really, and it's been a long time since U.S.-Pakistani relations have gotten better. For a long time, I think we talked about this there, the opinion of most Pakistanis towards the U.S. was extremely negative. And that started to get better during the Obama administration, as there were fewer drone strikes and increased public relations, and just and an increase in international relations in the area. Those have started to decline in the current administration, but it's always going to be a volatile relationship between the U.S. and any Middle Eastern country, especially one that has had such a checkered past with us, such as Pakistan. We then start to see that Malala is getting a greater degree of influence and attention for the work that she's doing. She's starting to do much more speeches, and she's actually being nominated for awards and being given honors for the work that she's doing as far as advancing education. We know that her father is doing a large amount of this as well, but she's kind of on the front lines for this women's movement to get more education for young women and to make sure that that's something that's available. She's actually getting money to do this as well. Her mother is not necessarily comfortable with this idea. She's concerned that increased exposure is going to lead to a concern as far as her safety. And that's not unfounded. The Taliban is still around, even if they're not quite as public as they used to be. But that financial freedom does help out Malala's family. They're able to buy land, they're able to buy dental implants for her mother, and they're actually able to take a lot of that money and start putting that back towards the people. The same thing that she was talking about in the previous chapters of wanting to help those that are in need. And she's thinking back to those kids that were in the dirt pile, in the mud pile, trying to find food and cans and things like that. She's able to turn that and make that money work for other people. So really starting to see the kind of person that Malala is trying to be. Chapter 18 is one of those unique ones. So the first thing is Malala goes to this major city, Karachi, and she's there because a school is being named in her honor, and they want to have this big kind of presentation for her. Not only is that interesting, but she also gets to visit the home, or at least like this museum of the founder of Pakistan, and she gets to see a lot of the history and a lot of the things that are going into it, and it brings up this interesting question for her, because she goes into the conflicts that are existing within Pakistan, not only because of the Taliban, but between the Pakistani people in general. And this idea of this country being split in so many different directions and not really feeling this element of unity. And how, should there still be a separation? Should we not have this unified country, but in fact have it split based on all of these conflicts and challenges? And it really brings up an interesting question, because this is a similar thing that we're seeing in our country, and we're seeing in other countries and parts of the world. But you can't help but see some of the similarities between the situations that she's describing and a lot of the ones that we're describing. These individuals in different parts of the country who culturally feel that they're very different from other parts of the country and maybe don't feel as represented, and it creates these conflicts. Now, I wouldn't say that we are dealing with nearly the level of violence that she's talking about in her country. As she says, Not one day goes where a single Pakistani hasn't been killed, but we've seen a number of violent situations between groups of individuals with differing opinions and viewpoints. You can think of like the situation in Charlottesville where you had the Unite the Right white supremacist rally that was going on. Then you had the protest of that rally and the opposition to that, and then a car coming through that protest group and killing a number of people utilizing that car. And you see situations like that and say, okay, here's one particular viewpoint of individuals that exist in our country and want their particular beliefs to be widespread and continued, and then the opposing group trying to protest and oppose that particular viewpoint, and then in the end there's violence and there's bloodshed and there's death. And while it's not necessarily as persistent and as continuous as Malala is talking about in her country, you can't help but see some of those similarities and oftentimes have some of those same questions. You know, I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say like, oh, if this happens, then we're going to secede, or if this happens, then we're going to have another civil war. And it's not an uniform. This isn't a situation that's isolated just to us or just to Pakistan. This is something that we're going to continue to see as humanity just continues on. This idea of you think one thing, we think another thing. At what point are those beliefs and are those viewpoints, are those going to be conflicted to such a degree that a country that was once unified and together actually finds that it needs to be separated? She doesn't really come to any solid conclusion when it comes to that, though. At the end, she comes to the conclusion that we should just focus on the things that are practical, making sure that people can read and write, making sure that things like electricity is available, that people are healthy, that people have access to food and water, the things that really matter most, not, are we interpreting the Quran the correct way, or whose viewpoint is correct and which one is the best. Things that can be clearly defined, clearly fixed. That's really her priority here. The chapter then introduces to us the first real instances that we've seen of not just Malala's father being targeted and threatened by the Taliban, but this is the first time that Malala herself has actually been threatened as far as her life is concerned. She's starting to get, like I said, a higher degree of influence. She's starting to become seen much more and is more exposed in terms of her presence in public. And the Taliban is starting to notice that. And while the Taliban does not have the impact that it used to have, especially in places like Mingora, they're kind of hidden away after the military situation that had occurred, they're still there. And they introduced this concept of, private Talibanization. They introduced this concept of a private Talibanization. I think I pronounced that right. Private Talibanization. Talibanization. There it is. A private Talibanization, where instead of the Taliban trying to focus on a large group and trying to influence this huge thing and have this huge power and amount of control, they're really focusing their efforts on just the certain individuals or certain things. Not trying to be widespread, but say like, you are the focus of our attention now. And that's really terrifying, to say that this individual or these groups of individuals are who we're going to direct all of our attention towards. And we've seen that the Taliban is not a weak group by any means. They may not be organized, they may not be as powerful as they once were, but their methods certainly haven't changed. And as I mentioned in some of our discussions earlier, if one group is willing to shed blood, whether it's their own or others, for their cause, that group is going to be infinitely more difficult and more threatening as time continues along. And Malala's going to have to see the realities of that as the story continues along. But here's the first instance that we see of Malala being the target, not just her father. Chapter 19 brings us back into focus really with that concept of the private Talibanization of what's occurring in Malala's life. We have this viewpoint, at least early on, of this image of Malala being a young girl just spending time with her friends and being in a really happy situation where they're going on picnics and they're enjoying time together and talking about things like Twilight and just enjoying what it means to be a young girl growing up. But then on the flip side of that, you have, once again, the increased presence of the Taliban, except this time, instead of the Taliban being this just outside force that's impacting her life and is having difficulties throughout Mingora, their focus is almost directly on the work that she and her father are doing in terms of maintaining peace and bringing about education. Malala's father gets a letter that has been photocopied and basically talks about how the school that he is running is allowing women to do these horrible things and allowing the girls to do these horrible things, and just ask the hotel manager and they'll tell you all about it, with the full intent of it being, no, they're not going to talk about that, they're just going to let people imagine what's going on. And you're starting to see people say, like, oh, people are talking badly about our school, they're talking badly about the girls that are going there. And it's really starting to, the focus of the Taliban's efforts are starting to really be directed on Malala and Malala's father, and that's starting to cause a lot of stress. In fact, we're starting to see individuals who are close to Malala's father and being part of this peace committee that he's in charge of are being executed and shot and killed. And Malala's father's refusing to back down. He's continuing to do what he normally does. He's still speaking. He's still meeting in presence. And he says, I'm not leaving. I'm not going anywhere else. I need to stay here. I need to be a part of this. I'm not going to back down. I'm not going to hide. That just means that they have won. And that's not going to do anything. All that is going to help me. That's not going to fix any of the issues that we're dealing with. And as far as he's concerned, that's a Taliban win. He does make some adjustments to his routine. He's not going in the same places. He's not, following the same things that he used to do just to make himself a bit more unpredictable. But by and large, he's continuing to go through with what he's meant to do this entire time, even though the focus is directly on him. And this is a big part of the discussion that we had throughout this week, is this idea of, if you were faced in a similar situation, what would you do? And a number of the responses were, well, I'd hide, or I'd make sure that my family is safe, or I'd keep trying to speak out, but as soon as things got too difficult, then maybe I'd back off. And that's exactly what the Taliban wants people like Malala's father to do. They want to see that once they're threatened, they will stop doing whatever it is that they were doing. They'll stop speaking out against them. And as far as they're concerned, that's a victory. And, a lot of the comments too were just like, well, go somewhere safe and publish that, maybe do your speeches or do your impacts remotely. It's difficult to galvanize a group of individuals if you're not there to speak for them or speak with them and have a power. We saw in previous chapters, people were going to Malala's father to ask for advice and ask for help. If he's not there, where do they go to? And it also goes back to the idea of, if one group is willing to go to the two extremes to get their point across, then you are automatically at a disadvantage. And ultimately, the Taliban's viewpoint is to threaten. And if threatening doesn't work, then action is what's going to work here. And if either accomplishes their goal, which is, you've been threatened, now you're going to stop, then they've won. And you've essentially given power to their methods. I'd argue that there isn't a way to have it both ways. A lot of people were trying to say, like, well, I'll continue to speak out, but I'll try to help my family. Or I'll continue to do this, but make sure that everyone's safe. Maybe I'll go anonymously. Maybe I will do like radio broadcasts like Fazlullah does. You can't have it both ways. You have to be willing to sacrifice something in order to achieve something else, especially when there's a group of individuals who are so willing to commit the most horrible acts that you necessarily wouldn't be able to commit. You have to say, what's the level of risk that I'm willing to accept for the cause that I'm trying to put across? And Malala's father has clearly made it out that his life he's not concerned with. Yes, he's concerned with the lives of his family, but not to the point where he is going to stop doing whatever it is that he's doing. And he says, he points out, like, don't harm my family necessarily, harm me. Like, I'm the person you can impact, or you can take this out on, not anybody else. And unfortunately, Malala has put herself, and in a lot of ways her family's put her in a position to where she is also now a target in this sort of thing. But it ultimately comes down to, if you have individuals or groups of individuals who are willing to kill you to stop you from doing and saying whatever it is that you feel for, that's going to test the convictions or the convictions that you have. If you feel so strongly for this particular thing that you are willing to take that risk, then continue to do so. But that's part of what comes with having, strong convictions and strong ideals. And Malala's seeing that right now, and Malala's father is seeing that right now. And so, if at any point you thought that, this is cool. It's admirable that they are trying to accomplish this particular goal. Really see the things that they're going up against when it comes to maintaining that sort of perspective. Really trying to continue along and get their viewpoints and their beliefs across, and really fighting for what they believe in. It truly is a fight, and there's real-time consequences to doing whatever it is that they're doing, but they believe so strongly in it that they're willing to make those risks.
In many patriarchal societies and tribal societies, fathers are usually known by their sons. But I'm one of the few fathers who is known by his daughter, and I'm proud of it.
This chapter ends on a pretty interesting note, because we see this real-time sort of problem that faces just about any teenager, or specifically any teenage girl, and that is boys. We have a boy in Malala's town who apparently is in love with her, and has been in love with her for a while, and well, except for that one time where a pretty girl had come and stayed with their neighbor, and he fell in love with her instead, and then she said, no, I'm not interested, so then he was back to being in love with Malala, and then when he left for his Army Cadet training and came back, he was like, hey, I see that you're famous now, I'm in love with you still, give me a call. Which is like, I would not exactly call that the most romantic method of trying to get a date, but, you know, hey, he's giving it a shot. And her dad is just like, nope, no thank you, not gonna happen. And just like tore into that dude, into the boy's father, and was just like, ain't gonna happen. So it's interesting to see Malala like dealing with real-time like teenager issues. And she even says like, you know, sometimes I wonder if it would be easier to be a Twilight vampire instead, which I wouldn't wish that upon anyone, Malala, I'm sorry, but that just sounds like a horrible existence. But it is interesting for her to kind of recount these very real-life teenager issues that are going on for her in the midst of all this real-time drama that is existing with her. And she even makes that comment too, like, if only the most difficult thing in her life right now was dealing with the affections of a boy that she's not interested in. Kind of gives you some perspective on what it is that she's dealing with. So at this point in the book, things are really starting to come to a head. We've seen throughout the book like this balance of Malala's life and the world that's going on in Pakistan, and how they're kind of on these paths, these journeys that are coming closer together. And we're getting dangerously close to those two paths conflicting here and contrasting, where the history and the things that are going on in Pakistan at this time and the challenges that are occurring are now going to be Malala's challenges and difficulties. We're getting really close to that point. And eventually Malala's life history and the history of Pakistan are going to converge, and they're going to meet at this point. And we knew that this was coming. We've seen it since the beginning of the book. It was introduced to us in the very first sentence, really, of the prologue. And we are now getting to that point where we've gotten to see who Malala is as a person, the experiences that she's encountered, the history that she's encountered, her family, her extended family, her friends, all of these things about her. And now we have this full concrete image of this teenage girl now, and how she's gotten to this point, and the battles that she's fighting alongside her father, and really what's gotten her here. And we've also gotten to see what's going on in Pakistan at the time, and what's going on in the world, and what they're encountering, what they're dealing with, and the difficulties and challenges that are happening, both with the issues in terms of the Afghanistan refugees and people coming into the country, the issues with the Taliban taking over and trying to infiltrate large portions of Pakistan, and their increased presence, and then things like earthquakes, floods, conflict with the US, just all of these things that are converging all together and giving us this really concrete viewpoint of what's going on at this point in the world with this particular individual in this particular country. And we're really starting to get to a massive, basically, convergence. And I think that this was the right way to go about getting us to this point, to really see what's going on in the world, what's going on in this country, and what's going on with this individual as we meet this real impactful point in a minute. So hopefully you guys are continuing to enjoy the book as we get towards its conclusion, and as we get towards the finale. We'll probably be finishing it within the next week and a half, and we'll continue to have discussions as well as some paragraphs to go along with it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video recap of everything that's been going on in the readings. we've had some kitty impact going on in the background, but I've been trying to make it educational and informational, but also put in some variations and differences in there just to make it a little bit more interesting. We'll continue to do more videos like this as we go along, and as we get into A Midsummer Night's Dream, we'll also see some additional things like that. Still trying to figure out what that's going to look like as we go through the rest of the year, but we'll make it happen. So until next time, I appreciate it, guys. We'll see you later, and have a good rest of your day. Thanks.